Okay, hi everyone. This video is about how to sew on a drop shoulder sleeve. Today I will be illustrating using the Edie top, but this video is relevant also to the Poppy dress, the Julia dress, and the Isabella top as well. Okay, so before you start, you should have your top or your dress front and back. You should have a sleeve piece which will look something like this. Depending on the pattern, it might be a bit longer, but anyway, it'll be this sort of shape. And if you're making the Edie top, you'll also have the ruffle pattern piece. Okay, so the first step is to sew the top or the bodice front and back together along the shoulder seams here. So just a simple stitch right along those shoulder seams to attach the front and back of the bodice or the top, and you'll also finish along that edge. Because I'm using a see-through fabric, I've done a French seam, but you can just use a regular seam. That is totally fine. The next step is to, if you're doing the Edie top, is to make the ruffle. Now, I haven't had anyone that's had any issues with this, so I've just gone ahead and sewn it up. But basically, all you have to do is finish along that curved seam. You then roll that seam over 1 centimeter toward the wrong side of the fabric and press it, and then roll it over again 1 centimeter toward the wrong side of the fabric and press it, and then top stitch along that edge, along that folded edge, just to hold that fold down. You'll then run 2 rows of gathering stitching right along this unfinished seam here, and then gather that up so it looks something like that. And yeah, at that point we'll be at this step. Okay, so this step is where you attach the ruffle to the sleeve. So with the right side of the fabric facing upward, you will attach the ruffle. Now the ruffle will also be right side facing outward. Some people have got confused about this and thought maybe it should be the right sides of the fabric facing toward each other. It's not. Make sure that the wrong side of the fabric is facing toward the right side of the sleeve. Okay? So all you have to do is pin the ruffle to the armhole edge of the sleeve along the seam here. Now there'll be a little 1 centimeter gap at each edge. That's totally fine. That is meant to be there. So yeah, just pin the ruffle right along that seam there, just to hold it in place while you sew it. This should all be hopefully relatively straightforward. So once you have pinned it right along there, you will sew it along that seam. Now I've actually made one already, so you can see it's quite similar. I've got my sleeve pattern piece here, which is right side facing toward me. I've got the ruffle pattern piece here, again, right side facing toward me. I have sewn the ruffle to the sleeve along here. You'll see I've got a small gap here and a small gap there, and I've just stitched it in between those 2 rows of gathered stitching. Now I've done that stitching in a long stitch, like a stay stitch, because we'll pull that stitching out at the end. You'll see I've done it in white. That's completely just for illustrative purposes. You can do it in the same color as the fabric. That's totally fine. So then after you stitch this ruffle to the sleeve along here, all you'll do is you'll finish all 4 edges of the sleeve, ensuring that you catch the ruffle pattern piece when you finish the armhole edge of the sleeve. So you'll finish that, and you will also finish the side seam of your bodice front and back. So if you see here, if that's the shoulder seams there and there, you'll finish along this seam here, right the way along. Because what we will do next is attach the sleeve to the bodice. Okay, so how you do that is, again, this step people get a little bit confused and think that it should be a different way around, but this is how you do it, I promise. So if you have the right side of the bodice facing towards you, and here you'll see I've marked with pins the 2 notches that you'll find on the front and back pattern pieces. And what you do is, so this is the sleeve and ruffle that you've just sewn. You put the right side of the sleeve facing toward the right side of the bodice. So it looks like that. So when you look at it here, you'll see the right side of the bodice and you'll see the wrong side of the sleeve. Again, you'll see here I've marked the 2 notches that are on the sleeve pattern piece. If you're making which one is it? The Isabella and the Julia dress, those notches will actually be at the end here where the sleeve is meant to finish. Because the sleeve is ruffled, it's hard to make a notch perfectly, so I've just marked here and here where the sleeve will finish. But if you're making this Edie top or the Poppy dress, the notches will be in the middle here. Okay, so all you have to do is pin the sleeve to the bodice, matching those notches, and pin it right the way along here, like so. Okay, you'll pin it right up to these edges as well, like so. Just like that. Okay, I know it looks a bit weird. It doesn't really make sense, but trust me, in the end, it will make sense. So from here, what you will do is you will stitch using regular stitching, so your normal length stitching, right along this seam here, attaching the sleeve to the bodice. You will start 1 centimeter in on this side here, and you will finish 1 centimeter in here. Why you do that will become obvious once we get to the next step. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stitch that now, and I will be back in a minute. Okay, so now, as you can see, I have now sewed a row of stitching right along here, attaching the sleeve to the bodice of the top of the dress. As I said before, I started sewing 1 centimeter in on this side, and I finished sewing 1 centimeter on this side here. So the next step from here is to sew the side seams of the bodice of the top of the dress together. Now when you're doing this, it's really important that you don't catch this underarm seam here and here while you're sewing. So the first thing you want to do is actually fold this over just to where you finish sewing here. Just fold it over like that and pin it down. Okay, and then do the same at this end here as well. So just fold it back and pin it down like that. Okay, and then what we'll do next is, with the right sides of the fabric facing each other, so you'll see in here this is the right side of the fabric, so I want to bring these 2 edges together like this, and I will pin along this seam here. So you'll see this is the bodice back, the bodice front's on the other side, and you'll pin along this seam here, which is the side seam of the bodice front and back. So you pin right along this edge And then after you pin it, you will sew a seam which will start right where you finished sewing. From where you sewed the sleeve to the bodice, you'll start where you finished sewing there and sew right along this seam, attaching the front to the back. Okay, so here is one I prepared earlier. So you'll see that's a similar seam, that's the side seam between the bodice front and the bodice back. You'll see when I open it up here that I've pinned those the underarm seam of the sleeve back so I don't catch it when I'm sewing, and I've just sewed a seam starting right here where that other seam between the sleeve and the bodice ends, right down to the end there. Okay, now the next step is to sew the underarm seam of the sleeve. So the first thing you'll do is you'll pull out these pins that you made in there, and you'll fold out the sleeve so the wrong side is facing outwards, so it'll look something like that. Then what you'll do is you'll just pin this underarm seam here together right the way along. So you'll want to start pinning here. Now you'll see when you start to pin, you'll see that seam where that seam finished between sewing the sleeve to the bodice. So that's where you want to start pinning there. And you'll pin it right the way along to the end of that underarm seam, just like that. Okay, and then from there, you will sew a seam that goes right the way along here, sewing the sleeve together along the underarm seam. Okay, so I will go ahead and do that now, and I will be back in just a minute. Okay, I'm back. I have just sewn this seam right along here, along the underarm seam of the sleeve, which means that that sleeve is now totally attached together. From here you can unpick all of this stay stitching and gathering stitching you used along this seam here, and you can also finish the edge of this seam. So you'll be folding it over 1 centimeter, pressing, folding it over another centimeter, and then top stitching around that edge. But if I show you, if I flip this out the right way, you can see here that I now have a sleeve attached to the bodice. Now obviously if you're making the poppy dress, you won't have this frilly bit. If you're making the Julia dress or the Isabella top, this edge will be gathered along here. But essentially, regardless of whether you're making Edie, Isabella, Julia or Poppy, this sleeve construction is really similar, so you can follow the same process. Okay, I hope that helps. Let me know if you have any questions.